I commented in an online, kind of a semi-private forum with some other missiologists, and I basically said, well, I would see that as deconstruction. And then somebody wrote back a pretty fiery response saying, that's all you got to do is say it's deconstruction, and it's never defined, and so nobody knows what it means, but it's a way of shooting down something that you don't particularly like. And I thought, fair enough. Why don't we spend a little bit of time and define what deconstruction is in the current missiological scene?
The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership between 1615 and Missio Nexus, who have a shared passion to mobilize the people of God to be a part of His mission.
Hello once again, and welcome to the Mission Matters podcast. I'm Matthew Ellison, joined by my good friend, co-host, and today guest on the Mission Matters podcast. He's not only the co-host, but I'm going to be interviewing Ted. How's it going, brother?
It's going well. How are you doing today, Matthew?
Yeah, I'm doing well by God's grace. Well, I heard you share some things at the Missions Leaders Conference in Orlando not long ago, and they were very thought-provoking. And so I threw out the idea, why don't we introduce these ideas to our podcast audience? And you agreed. So Ted, we're going to talk today about deconstructing missions in the United States. And maybe we could start off with just a fundamental question. What is deconstruction?
Well, that's a good question to start with because my writing and thinking on that came first from this very question to me when I commented in an online, kind of a semi-private forum with some other missiologists. And I basically said, well, I would see that as deconstruction. And then somebody wrote back a pretty fiery response saying, that's all you got to do is say it's deconstruction, and it's never defined. And so nobody knows what it means, but it's a way of shooting down something that you don't particularly like. And I thought, fair enough. Why don't we spend a little bit of time and define what deconstruction is in the current missiological scene? So that was more or less the genesis for this article. And I would say that, from a very broad brush, deconstruction is anything that diminishes our ability. The deconstruction of mission is anything that denigrates or removes a definition of mission, which is not focused on obedience to the command of Christ to disciple the nations. And it's coming at us now in a bunch of different ways. And so I began thinking about this, started writing some things up, floated some things around a few journal editors. And just this month, Mere Orthodoxy picked the article up. It's already in their print publication. And probably by the time this is on the air, it will be online on their website as well. And what I do in this article is I go into what I would consider to be the four contemporary approaches to deconstruction that we're seeing in broader missiology.
So Ted, before we unpack those four aspects of deconstruction, maybe you could talk about what's behind the current deconstruction of missions. What has led to this scrutiny right now? And two more questions. How is it helpful? How is it not helpful? So why? What led to this? And is it helpful? Not helpful?
Well, first of all, I'll start with the is it helpful, not helpful question. And I would say, we need to be critically engaged, and we need to be constantly looking at our methodologies, our strategies, our ways that the big frameworks that we're using to think about mission. And so this isn't this is not a repudiation of all things, missiological or things that people are attempting or trying. Mm-hmm. But it is important for us to not only be critical about the methodologies and strategies being used, but also of the criticisms being lodged, especially today, because critical thinking, critical theory has taken a real forefront kind of spot in academia. And so it's led to lots of fallout in lots of different areas of life, and mission certainly being one of them. And so then I would also just say that this topic is pertinent right now because of this. Postmodernism is essentially a deconstructionist pastime or habit. And so I think now's an approach. This actually should have been happening a long time ago when we were looking at what's going on here with our larger missiological themes. So it can only make us better. I do think that one of the struggles we have in missions is unlike theology. So you and I can have a theological debate and talk about some very abstract things. Missionaries are a little bit different because they actually have to do things. And so the theology is acted out upon. And once you act out upon the theology that you're talking about, it actually goes back and impacts that theology. I'll just give you one funny little example. When I was a church planter overseas, we had a church that met in a building down a busy street road going down to the main marketplace. And people would walk up and down that street. And we would do church. It was a Muslim area. We would do church inside this building, and we always kept the windows open so people could see inside, because I know they were very curious. And after being there for a few months, we began to realize that they called us the Church of the Overhead Projector, because back in those days, when you led worship, you use an overhead projector and you put the words on the overhead projector and they got put up on the wall. And that method of worship became the identifier for our identity as a church. And so everything you do is going to be analyzed and scrutinized in a context and in a way that you may not think it will be analyzed and scrutinized in. And thus, it leads us to wanting to be thoughtful about these kind of things.
Yeah, so you also answered the why question. So let's just dive into these 4 aspects of deconstruction that you see today. The first one, when everything is missions.
So this one you know well, Matthew, because you've written a book and a follow-up book on this topic. And I would say this one in particular has really hit the Western movement in a significant, substantial way. When everything is missions is, if you're ever driving out of the Baptist church on a Sunday morning and you see that sign, you are now entering the mission field.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me just say, no, you are not. You might be, but you most likely are not.
Right.
But that idea that everybody is a missionary, I think it really permeates a lot of our thinking about missions. And in doing that, it takes away the sharp edge. There's something different. If I was to describe to you taking the gospel into a hostile, let's say a hostile Islamic culture, across the ocean, across many cultural hurdles, there's something qualitatively different about that.
Yeah.
And about you sharing the gospel with your brother-in-law who's not a believer.
Mm-hmm.
But when we call all of that or put all of that kind of in the same category, we are diminishing the importance and the urgency of many missions topics, not the least of which is this concept of unreached cultures, in which there's no Christians, no churches, etc. Let me tell you that I think we come by this one honestly because of our missions history. So this is a little bit of a controversial take. I know not all missiologists agree with me on this. Actually, next week I'm heading over to London. I have a feeling it's going to be a topic of conversation that I have with some missiologists there. But Missio Dei theology has been a large part of our big framework for how we think about missions. And I would say it kind of reached its nadir, its height, in 2010 when Christopher Wright presented at Urbana. And what he really did, his book, The Mission of God, really highlighted Missio Dei missiology. Now, I am not throwing bricks at Missio Dei. I think it brought a lot of good things. Missio Dei essentially teaches that God is on mission. The most we do is join him in mission. Another way you might have heard the kind of popularized version of this is Henry Blackaby, when he says, find where God is working and join him there, something to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
I've always hated that phrase, by the way, because if you think about the kinds of frontline mission work, you're actually trying to find places where, from a human perspective, you don't see God working,
That's right.
and those are the ones we prioritize. It's kind of like the flip of that
Yep.
idea. But when we say that God is on mission and he's on mission everywhere, and etc., it's really abstracting mission to, I think, an unhelpful extent. I got to back up in history just a little bit and just say that Missio Dei theology, part of what it did that was a real helpful thing was to combat human agency in how we go about fulfilling the Great Commission. So it came about when modernity was growing. And modernity, I'm not a philosopher par excellence, but let's talk about it as the idea that mankind can essentially strategize and use scientific methods to be more effective and more efficient in delivering whatever it is it wants to provide. And really, in the run up to World War II, particularly, modernity was just in the air everywhere, including in missions. And so, Missio Dei was an attempt to say, hey, missions is what God's doing. It's not what we strategize and make happen by our own cleverness. There's a big lesson for us in that, particularly when I see things like I see advertisements like we can plant a church for $400. And that's an ad I saw last week. That sort of manipulation of mission, that's something Missio Dei helpfully kind of contradicts.
Mm-hmm.
What's not helpful about it is it becomes like the Sunday school answer of Jesus. The kid gets called on to answer a question in Sunday school. He's not paying attention. So he says, Jesus, and he's right 90% of the time. That's kind of what Missio Dei can also do to us. It can kind of denude us of the sharp spear, the pointy tip, the things that we need to do to move forward. And it denigrates mission in a sense. I don't. Anything you would add to that as the author of 2 books on this topic?
Well, I've often wondered if this increasingly post-Christian culture that we live in today is also a factor. We know it's happening. And so in order to share the gospel in our context, we have to be more missions-like. I'm going to use that word missions-like. We need to contextualize. We need to, use those practices that missionaries use when they're crossing cultures, around the world. But I think there's a differentiation we have to remember. This is a post-Christian culture, not a pre-Christian culture. So the air we breathe, the culture we live in requires a missions-like advance of the gospel, but that doesn't mean everyone's a missionary. And I want to throw in this thing from Justin Long. I just love it. It's a thought leader exercise. I've used it before, Ted, probably on this podcast, but I think it's really good. When a pastor says to me, yes, everyone's a missionary, I believe that. I say, okay, let's just move forward on that. Do you believe the Holy Spirit has gifted and appointed every member of your church to be identified by the leaders of your church, to be then sent out, supported to a different culture with the gospel? Do you believe that is the will of the Spirit for everyone in your church, that they've been appointed to that work? And the pastor says, of course not. And I said, well, that person we just described, appointed by the Spirit, sent out, affirmed by leaders, what do we call that person? And they say, well, missionary. Oh, you don't really believe everyone's a missionary, then everyone's an evangelist. Everyone should be a disciple, a witness. And if we're going to call everyone a missionary, then we need a different terminology for that tip of the spear, Ted. But let's not go there, because missionary is actually a good word. It's a Latin derivative connected to sent one. So anyway, those are my thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I would agree. And your first comment kind of touched a little bit on, I'd say, another important name in missiology, and that's Leslie Newbigin. When he came back from India and saw how far gone British culture was, how they had kind of given up their interest in the gospel, he felt like he was a missionary all over again a second time. Mm-hmm. And so some of what we face now when we say missions is everything is also because Newbigin I think rightly, was reminding us of the missionary mandate of the church. And we just got to remember to put some guardrails on what that means
Yeah.
so that we don't completely lose the specific nature of the call. And I shouldn't even use the word call because that's a whole other box of worn out missiological issues we got to discuss and describe it. But let's just say that God does specifically set aside some people to do something different than the rest of the congregation, and those would be the missionaries that you're describing.
That's right. That's right. Okay, moving on. It's somebody else's job, Ted.
Yes, we might call this mercenary missions. This is when we begin to believe that somebody else is better suited, better equipped, cheaper, more effective, more efficient to bring the gospel than I am. And therefore, my role is relegated to nothing or to praying or to maybe giving, but that's it. And this one was really popularized through a book called The Next Christendom by Phil Jenkins, published, I don't know, it's got to be 25 or 30 years ago now, in which he noted that the global South Church had grown and now was really the ones taking the gospel to its final destination. Now, just like the first one, there's some good stuff there. There's some great stuff there, in fact. And definitely true that if you're going out as a missionary today, unless you're really going to a very unreached place, the chances that you're not going to have partners already in place that you could be working with, it's minimal. Today, there are opportunities for partnership that didn't exist at all 50, 60 years ago. And so the nature of mission has changed. However, we can't give up on the calling or on the model, on the example we see in the book of Acts, where God has churches sending their own by the direction of the Holy Spirit. And this one is complicated in so many ways too. We're always searching for silver bullets, easy ways to get the job done. And I would just say, particularly mega churches, and I'm sorry to pick on you, but you're the worst offenders in this area, and wealthy business people, they're always searching for that kind of like venture capital startup pitch deck idea that's going to solve the Great Commission in a generation. It's not going to happen that way. If it does happen, it's going to be through something really surprising that God does that right now we are unable to really fathom or comprehend. There are no silver bullets here. And paying nationals to do it, that's got its own set of issues and problems. And we as Westerners have ruined a lot of great missionary work by thinking we can just write a check and see the job accomplished. Again, we got to chew gum and walk at the same time.
Yeah.
That is a necessary thing we should be doing. I personally give a portion of my time to making sure that funding is going from the wealthy West countries to the global South missionary force that needs the funding. I am not opposed to this, but what I see are churches deciding this is what we do instead of having skin in the game and sending our own.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely. I want to make a comment here. I'm really passionate about this. We are anemic. The church. I love the church, and there's pockets of beautiful things happening. Ted, you were just talking yesterday about some of our lament over the fact that we're not a part of this story, and it's sad to see. And yet we see pockets of what God's doing. So this is not meant to be a harsh criticism, but we're spiritually anemic. And if we continue to outsource missions to others, if we only hire other people to suffer in our place, we're going to be spiritually poorer. And so I think this is also about the health and the vitality of the church. I think it was Dr. John Piper. He said, missions is not only necessary for the life of the world, it's necessary for the life of the church. No local church can afford to go without the nourishment and encouragement that will come to it by sending its own sons and daughters to the unreached. So there's a church health issue here as well. But I agree with you. It's both and. It's not either or. If I was a missions pastor again, I would come alongside national workers in a meaningful partnership. and I would also send my own where it was appropriate. So we've got 2 more to go, so I better keep things moving along here. Diaspora, Ted. Diaspora ministry is the new silver bullet. Why go over there? We can just reach them right here.
Well, this is a subset of this number 2, the idea that we can substitute sending for something else. I love diaspora ministry. We just did a podcast interview with a ministry that does international student ministry. Again, this is one, we should be leaning into this whole hog. This is something we should be definitely doing. But you're not going to reach the world. You're not going to reach the unreached of the world by focusing on diaspora ministry. The statistics there are just it just makes it implausible. You have arguably 3.25% of the world's population living outside of their birth country. That's a small number compared to the billions of unreached people that are out there. So, we've got to get away from this idea that all we got to do is diaspora work. And in fact, let me just say one thing I find a little bit, I don't know, shocking is the wrong word, but it's funny to me that we've had so much emphasis on removing Western influence in mission, but diaspora ministry is really more about Western mission than anything else. The UK and the US, I mean, you can put this in your AI engines and see anywhere from 17 to 20 or 25% of their populations are foreign born. And so we're kind of living in this soup. And so for us, this is the most important issue in missions. But if you were to go to, let's say, northern India and be in these massively large people groups that are Islamic, they're not even Hindu, and see how homogenous they are, once you step foot inside them, you're going to just see that now there's going to have to be some purposeful penetration in these places, that it's just not going to happen by doing diaspora ministry.
Yep. I'm with you. I'm an advocate for it. I champion it. Every church I work with, have you lifted your eyes to look who God has brought to your city, to your neighborhood? But that can't be a replacement, as you said. All right, we have left-wing missiology and right-wing missiology to round this out.
So the next one is left-wing missiology, and I would just kind of say this is akin to the infusion of anti-colonialism and CRT type ideas into our understanding of what missions is. Now, I just need to say up front and center that yes, missions and colonialism are inextricably linked because of the overwhelming presence of British missions in the history of missions. And you could pick on other Western countries too, but so many Brits went out as missionaries during the time of colonialism. William Carey would be an example of it. But William Carey is also an example of how it's way more complicated than we think. William Carey went out during the colonial era, but the British wouldn't let him carry on his missionary activities, and he had to actually find refuge. I believe it was with the Danish consulate to have permission to be in India, because the British wouldn't give it to him because of his activism against widow burning that made him a pariah among the Brits that just wanted peace. And they were afraid that William Carey would generate consternation in the culture. So these are really complicated stories. They're not easy. And but the church and missions is way bigger than colonialism. And the need to get the gospel out there is way bigger. Now, we haven't announced this as Missio Nexus yet, but we're about to come out with an episodic, 5 to 6 hour series, podcast series on colonialism in mission. And it'll be interesting to see how that shapes up and what it looks like. Actually haven't listened to the whole thing yet. I'm going to get it here in the next day or two. It's an important topic for us to be wrestling with, but we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Mm-hmm. And if we make mission, this one is ultimately about power and powerlessness, in trying to frame all missionary work in this milieu of power and powerlessness. And that is simply not a rubric that you can place on top of what we see happen in the New Testament. And so, good issue to think about, good issue to discuss, but it should not be a showstopper. So that would be on the left-hand side. And by the way, I would just say that one there is really influencing academic missiology in a big way.
Yeah.
And it's sad for me to see once great academic institutions that used to teach and train missionaries now spend all their time writing deconstruction papers on missions, and it's unfortunate. Now, that has its counterpart, and that's the right-hand side of the same issue, and that is becoming so nationalistic that you don't see God's heart for the nations. This one was kind of hard to write up, Matthew. And part of the reason why is the other three areas are well documented. This one lives mostly on social media.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, some of these proponents, you can challenge them, and I have a couple times on Twitter, and they kind of back off because they know it's wrong to say that you shouldn't evangelize the world. But their hatred for foreigners comes through in what they say and how they say it. And I don't even like to use that word hatred. It's become so abused. But it's hard to categorize some of this language any other way. And so I'm using it in the narrow sense, not the broad sense here when I'm using it. And I do think that we run the risk of missing the wonderful opportunities, like we talked about with Diaspora ministry, right here among us.
Yeah.
If we become so attached to kind of right-wing politics surrounding immigration in particular that we don't see the need to love the stranger that's here among us.
Yeah. I was just at a mission symposium in Canada, and one of the speakers taught out of Acts, and he said, even after the resurrection, they come together, and the first question is, when will you restore the kingdom of God to Israel? He'd risen from the dead, he'd fulfilled the prophecy, and they were still focused on empire. Not until Pentecost happens, and then even all the way to Acts 13. I mean, it's slow, but then it finally breaks open in Acts 13, and the gospel starts to spread to the nations. But, there was this idea that we want Israel to be at the top, even after all that had taken place. And this one is a challenging one for sure, Ted.
Matthew, that struggle, the position of Israel, even in the church, it overshadowed all of Paul's ministry.
Yeah.
And you can read in the New Testament where Paul continually has to return back to this question of the Gentiles and their inclusion in the covenant. He's doing it all through his writing, all the way through. And in our context, as we interject our church forms, so one example of this has been in the missions world, a lot of ministries, probably 80 to 90% of them, have moved toward house church planting and models that basically decenter the pastor-centric model that we have. And I just see our churches struggle with that. They want to see preaching and teaching done in the same. We've done it here since the Reformation. And it's about forms. It's not simply about preaching and teaching in terms of helping people learn and understand the gospel. We are trying to continuously export these forms. And I would say they're using a new term for it. Now they're calling it church-centric. I'd probably call it more pastor-centric than just church-centric. And I love the church. I'm all about church planning. I'm not down on the church in any way, shape, or form. But let's not deconstruct the gospel by insisting that our church forms travel with it when they go globally. We don't need to do that. And so this one is a little insidious. You do have the kind of blatant, in-your-face, anti-immigration piece to it, but you also have the more subliminal, we're trying to reproduce ourselves now all over the world as we go out and do ministry.
Yeah. Well, you're not afraid of a little controversy, Ted. It's one of the things I love about you. You're the provocateur, but I appreciate the heart. I think it's moving people towards critical thinking about these things, and we need to think biblically and critically about missions?
Well, we do. And I do, and, I would just say this. I got my next Substack article is going to be No Silver Bullets. And I do think that we suffer a little bit in evangelicalism, always looking for the next kind of quick fix.
Yeah.
And we need to realize that church planting in these difficult areas is multi-generational. It's going to require slogging. It's going to require innovation. All sorts of things are going to be necessary to see these cultures transformed for the gospel. And we've got to pray and think long-term and not short-term as we go about it.
Yeah. So what have we learned here today? I'm going to end with a quote. Critical thinking's good. We encourage it, just like you said, but it can go too far. So here's the quote. Does the Great Commission really need to be rethought? Perhaps better, it needs rediscovery by a new generation. Perhaps it needs new expression in a new culture or era. Yet the basic command of Christ to make disciples of the nations, the core of the Great Commission, stands the test of time and needs no new paradigm to supplant it. You know who wrote that?
I do.
That's Ted Esler's quote from our book, Conversations on When Everything is Missions. That's his last paragraph. Well said, Ted. Well said.
Thank you, Matthew. It's been a great discussion. Appreciate you, brother.
Yeah, likewise.
Before you go, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership of 1615 and Missio Nexus. Check out 1615.org and missionexus.org for more resources on the mission of God and the matters of the mission. The Mission Matters podcast is hosted by Matthew Ellison, president of 1615, and Ted Esler, president of Missio Nexus.